Welcome to the debate. Today, we're examining the legislative process behind Japan's GX Decarbonization Power Source Law. This law has, fundamentally reformed how nuclear reactors are regulated, moving away from fixed operational limits and, in doing so, sparking some profound institutional controversy.
It certainly has, and the controversy, really, it doesn't center on the goal of decarbonization itself. I think that's widely supported. But on the, let's say, the procedural and institutional costs of getting this law passed. We're looking at that critical post-Fukushima separation principle, the firewall between the utilization side, that's the energy agency, or NHO, and the supposedly independent regulatory side, the Nuclear Regulation Authority, the NRA.
So the central question we really have to get into, which comes directly from all the scrutiny of this process, is this. Did the administrative methods and the decision-making that we saw, characterized by this opaque interagency coordination and a really contested use of majority rule, did it fatally compromise the independence and transparency that was intended for nuclear regulation?
I would argue it did. I maintain that the procedural opacity, the administrative evasion, and the, frankly, severe breakdown of internal consensus fatally undermined regulatory independence and, by extension, democratic accountability. The process itself was fundamentally flawed.
And I'll be arguing that the measures taken were, in fact, necessary administrative and legal realignments. They were justifiable responses to institutional demands. And crucially, they resulted in a jurisdictional clarification that actually established a demonstrably more rigorous technical safety regime for aging reactors.
My position really begins with legal necessity. The entire push to relocate these operational limits was actually triggered by the NRE itself. If you go back to 2020, the NRE concluded that the existing 40-year limit on a reactor's operation wasn't fundamentally a safety requirement. It was more of a policy or utilization matter, an essentially arbitrary political limit. So to genuinely uphold that separation firewall, that policy-based rule had to be legally moved from the regulatory statute, the Reactor Regulation Law, over to the utilization statute, the Electric Utilities Law, which is NHO's jurisdiction.
This legal overhaul was essential not just for energy stability, but also to meet the broader decarbonization goals of the GX policy. The most important result, though, is that the new regulatory framework is inherently stricter. It mandates rigorous, frequent technical evaluations, specifically every 10 years after a reactor hits 30 years of operation, through what they're calling the long-term facility management plan. This ensures that technical safety, not some arbitrary date on a calendar, is the overriding priority.
I come at this from a completely different angle. While moving to a technical-based evaluation sounds great in theory, the integrity of the whole process was compromised from the very start by a culture of, frankly, administrative evasion and secrecy. The creation of the law became a black box. When the Diet started pressing for detailed documentation of the interagency discussions, especially between NHO and the NHO staff gave this alarming justification for why there were no records. They dismissed these critical talks as mere mental exercises or unripe ideas, explicitly denying they qualified as formal administrative documents. Now, this fundamentally violates public records principles, and it suggests a deliberate attempt to shield the whole process from scrutiny. And even more damaging, it was revealed that the utilization side, NHO, had actively drafted the amendment image for the Reactor Regulation Law, which is strictly the NRA's legal turf, and then presented it to the regulation side. This is a severe, textbook breach of that separation principle. We just can't judge the system's health solely by the final text of the law. We have to judge it by its adherence to transparent, independent processes.
Okay, so let's drill down right into that core institutional breach, the integrity of regulatory separation. Your defense of this as just necessary technical coordination really can't stand when the utilization agency, NHO, is essentially usurping the regulation agency's legislative role. It was confirmed that NHO drafted that amendment image for the Reactor Regulation Law.
Internally within the NRA, their own discussions acknowledged this was an extraordinary act of overreach, with officials even noting they should have rejected it outright. This demonstrates, I think pretty conclusively, that the promotion side was actively steering the regulatory framework And that is precisely the line that should never have been crossed after the lessons of 2011.
That is a powerful charge, I grant you. And the optics surrounding NHO's involvement are undeniably terrible. However, I think framing it as utilization steering regulation misses a crucial operational reality. This early drafting effort by NHO was presented as reference information only. Its functional purpose was just to facilitate the technically clean transfer of that policy rule, the 40-year limit, to the Electric Utilities Law, which, again, was their mandate. The essential point, which I think preserves the spirit of separation, is that the NRA leadership consistently asserted that NHO did not influence the core safety standards themselves. A key NRA official even confirmed that they later told NHO, look, changes to the reactor regulation law are our sole jurisdiction, you need to step back. The separation was maintained where it mattered most, in setting the actual technical safety requirements.
And that takes us directly to the governance crisis you mentioned inside the Nuclear Regulation Authority. I agree the decision process was contentious. The new regulations were reached after a pretty substantial internal debate. We're talking 9 rounds of deliberation over 5 months. And yes, the final vote was 4-1. But the NRA is legally set up as a collegial body. It has the full legal authority to use majority votes to formalize decisions. I'd argue this majority vote was necessary to formalize a scientifically justified regulatory shift, moving the NRA away from an arbitrary fixed political period to a technical condition-based review system. Holding on to an arbitrary 40-year limit just for political consensus is not scientifically rigorous. The majority vote in this case allowed the NRA to follow the science.
That's an interesting defense, that the vote was a necessary functional decision, but I would frame it very differently. Historically, fundamental safety decisions inside the NRA relied almost entirely on a tradition of unanimous agreement. And why? Because public trust in nuclear safety requires that the whole body of scientific experts stands together. The sudden forced 4-1 majority vote signals a profound internal fracture, which I believe was driven by external political pressure tied to the GX schedule and energy goals. This pressure essentially hastened the scientific independence of the NRA. And what's more, the dissenting member, Commissioner Ishiwatari, argued that claiming the new system was strict regulation was basically meaningless because the concrete specifics of that long-term facility management plan, the actual technical roadmap for assessing aging reactors, had not yet been fully defined or approved by the board. This isn't just a governance problem, it is the expert body sacrificing its own internal rigor and scientific certainty to meet an external political deadline. And we just can't overlook the culture of transparency here, or more accurately, the complete lack of it. The systematic failure to document discussions by using that mental exercise loophole isn't just poor administration. It looks like a systemic strategy to avoid public accountability. This culture of deliberate avoidance is best illustrated by the infamous station handover. Documents for 7 critical, non-public, inter-agency meetings were literally exchanged at a train station. It's astonishing. You have the highest levels of government exchanging critical policy documents on a public train platform. The excuses that they were avoiding secure email or that office visits were inconvenient, it just strains all credibility. The former NRA chair initially tried to defend this as the custom, before he had to concede that, quote, normal people don't exchange documents at a station. This deliberate secrecy, right after a reform meant to increase transparency, suggests the new rules were immediately rendered, well, a mere formality.
I'm not convinced that a few instances of extremely poor organizational culture equate to the subversion of the entire regulatory framework. Look, the station handover and the initial denials were regrettable procedural errors, and they created disastrous optics. I completely agree. But we have to differentiate between poor record-keeping practices and malicious regulatory failure. The administrative staff defended their actions under the Public Documents Management Law, arguing that personal memos and internal contacts aren't legally required to be documented as formal administrative documents if they're considered preliminary. This points to a deeply ingrained flaw in Japan's bureaucratic culture around informal talks, yes, but here is the critical rebuttal. The documents related to those 7 meetings were eventually submitted to the Diet, albeit late. This proves the core information was retained, not permanently suppressed. The process was flawed, it was secretive,
But the fundamental safety standards were, in the end, legally established by the NRA after 5 months of debate.
But that secrecy undermined the very legitimacy of the process. If the utilization side is drafting the regulatory law, and the regulatory side is making decisions under a cloud of secrecy, exchanging documents at train stations, how can the public possibly trust that the separation firewall holds? Sure, the lost transfer might have been necessary, but the way it was executed severely damaged the institutional trust that was only painstakingly being rebuilt after Fukushima. When the regulation body fractures its own internal consensus with that 4-to-1 vote and proceeds with key safety standards still left undefined, the result is a sacrifice of procedural integrity for political expediency.
Expediency, perhaps, but also necessity. When you're facing an urgent energy shortage and critical decarbonization targets, legal and institutional realignment has to proceed. And we can't forget the positive outcomes. Replacing that arbitrary 40-year political limit with the long-term facility management plan, which requires a comprehensive technical assessment every decade after 30 years, moves us toward a regime based on verifiable material conditions, not historical assumptions. The content of the safety regime is what matters most in the end. And that content is demonstrably more rigorous now. So, to summarize my position, navigating the complexities of modern energy policy requires legal coherence across government agencies. And the need for this transfer was in fact initiated by the regulator itself. Despite the undeniable, severe procedural missteps and the terrible optics around their documentation practices, the core objective of clarifying jurisdictional separation was met. And crucially, the resulting safety outcome is a more robust technology-based review schedule for aging reactors, replacing an arbitrary time limit. This was a necessary step to secure a stable energy supply while prioritizing technical safety.
And from my perspective, what this material overwhelmingly reveals is that the administrative culture remains hostile to the kind of deep transparency that was mandated post-Fukushima. The utilization side encroached on regulation by drafting the law, key records were suppressed through that mental exercise loophole, and the regulatory body's own collegial governance was fractured by a forced majority vote to meet external political deadlines. The institutional risk posed by this lack of public accountability in setting long-term nuclear safety policy, I think, far outweighs the claimed benefit of a new technical plan whose core specifics were, at the time, still undefined.
This whole debate shows that even when facing urgent energy challenges like decarbonization and security, that trade-off between procedural transparency and policy implementation is incredibly difficult. It forces us to decide which foundational principles we're willing to risk when speed is paramount.
Exactly. We are left to weigh institutional integrity against urgent policy goals, and clearly that tension is still very much active in the legislative history of this law. There is certainly more to explore in how this new regulatory culture actually takes hold.